Okay, excellent. So, firstly, thank you for everyone for coming on a rainy Sydney night. It's a bit rainy and cold out there, so you've made the effort to come here tonight, which is excellent. Really, appreciated by myself and I'm sure the panel members. This is going to create the opportunity to actually make this event what it's intended to be, which is a public forum, which therefore includes questions from the audience. So I want to throw it out there now that if you at any point have questions after each speaker, you can put your hand up and Emiko from Nutrition Care is going to run to you and bring you a microphone. So that's going to be an opportunity to get your questions answered. If you have a specific question about something one of the panel members said, or a specific question about how can our professions be advanced in terms of our place in the health system through registration or other means, this is, that's going to involve us. This is what we want to do in our profession is create a community. Tonight we're a community of holistic health practitioners, so your involvement is part of that. So I just want to make sure that that's coming through okay, is that right? Just using this one because otherwise I have to just bend over too much. So I just want to start as well by thanking Nutrition Care for sponsoring the event. They've paid for the venue, which has made my job a lot easier, and it was very easy as well. It wasn't, it happened very quickly that it was ticked off, which is much appreciated. There's sampling out there of the liquid herbs, the alcohol-free liquid herbs that Nutrition Care has, and some other supplements, B12 and things like that. My mouth is a bit numb after taking the carve up, and I'm feeling particularly relaxed. So I just wanted to point out, the purpose of tonight was essentially a follow-up from a public forum that we had 4 years ago. It was exactly 4 years and 1 week ago that we were in this very room, and we had Ian Breakspear in the audience that night. We had Stephen Myers and John Wardle on the panel as well. And so this is a follow-up to that. Back then, it was a question of shall naturopaths be registered on AHPRA, yes or no? And now this is a follow-up, which is we decided yes. And so how do we get there? And to clarify how to get there, and if we can be clearer on how to get there, it'll make that more likely to happen, obviously, right? Because I think there's a lot of confusion out there about what's actually required. So I was speaking with some of the panel members earlier, saying, what's really required? Do all the states have to sign it off first, and then federal signs it off, federal health minister, or who exactly is it? Or what exact processes and factors need to be in place? So if you, as our expert panel, wouldn't mind elaborating on that and clarifying that in as simplistic terms or as clear of terms as possible, we'd really appreciate it. Thanks very much. I just wanted to say, advancing our professions is about a few things. Registration is one, but I'm sure there's many ideas out there about how we can do it. So on the table just there on the right, there's a couple of pieces of paper where you can write down ideas about what we can do to bring our professions, naturopaths and nutritionists, into a better place in health systems. And those ideas might lead to a new idea or another idea, or that idea might be adapted, or that idea might be used itself to by people like us who are lobbying and trying to make trying to bring the professions forward. So at the end, if you want to write down the ideas, please feel free, because I think that's a really good way to create momentum as well, is to come up with ideas. Random things, wild ideas, whatever it is, throw it out there. It's sort of the Einstein method, just like throwing it out there and seeing what might come of that. Because one problem that I found in terms of advancing our professions and lobbying politicians, speaking to politicians about these things, is that one problem is that many politicians don't know what really a naturopath or a nutritionist, a holistic nutritionist really does. And so they're actually, when they don't know what those professions do, then they're not terribly interested. So we need to get our professions on the radar of the people who make decisions and get us known so that we can we can advance. Can I ask, are there any dietitians in the room? Because what we want to do is we want to be up there with dietitians. At the moment, dietitians get almost all the referrals from GPs, and we want to provide holistic healthcare as well to the community. It's not just about advancing our professions, it's actually the bigger picture is how do we make holistic healthcare available to the community to make people healthier? Because it's that holistic approach, dealing with underlying factors, dealing with trying to treat the cause, or the whole holistic approach that is what people, the very thing that people need, rather than just one isolated symptom that we're going to treat in isolation. We might look at underlying factors, liver function, digestive health, adrenal function, for example, and how much is that being provided out there in the community? Not enough, is what I say. So that's kind of why we're here, to provide that for people. Basically, there's a lot of questions on Facebook. Will this be recorded? And the answer is yes, it's being recorded right now. And it'll go up on the website. It'll go up on naturopathmax.com afterwards at some point when I can put it up there. Basically, we've got 5 excellent speakers tonight. We're going to start off with Kate Broderick, who is from Adelaide, and is going to be speaking about the situation of registration and regulation in America, which might just give us a different perspective on how things happen in different parts of the world, even if that's very different to how it is in Australia. Thanks for coming, Kate. Next we'll have Ian Breakspear after Kate, and Ian's going to talk about some of the elements in relation to education of naturopaths and nutritionists, but also in relation to which professional association you might want to support, depending on what you value. Whether you want to value the advancement of the profession or you want to just remain status quo. Ian's going to identify some of those factors. After Ian, we've got John Wardle, who's going to talk about the nuts and bolts of registration. And then comes Sandy Davidson, who's going to speak specifically about for the nutritionists and what lies ahead for nutritionists in terms of the future of that profession. And we're finishing with Stephen Myers. Thanks very much for flying down from Lismore, Stephen, appreciate it. Who's going to finish with some more information on the education, making practitioners safe practitioners in the community, and also a bit on the bigger picture when it comes to our professions. And I'm so passionate about the holistic work that we do as naturopaths or as nutritionists, because the nutritionists who are working holistically can provide so much more support to the health of people in the community than they're getting at the moment. So that's where I want to finish and start with our first speaker, Kate Broderick. Thank you.
I'm Kate Broderick, and as my accent might imply, I'm from North America. And I was trained at Bastyr University as a naturopathic physician, and I'm also a traditional 5-element acupuncturist, trained in Seattle as well. So I'm going to give a bit of comparative information between the US framework and the Australian framework. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Cool. And it's a bit of an apples to oranges comparison, so I'm going to try and draw out some comparators that are relevant and sort of leave everything else to the side. I'm certainly not going to give you the whole picture of regulation in the US. So certainly, currently there are 17 states and 3 territories in the US that have some kind of licensure or regulation for naturopathic doctors. In 3 or 4 states, that is a physician level licensure, so it is a licensure essentially as a primary care physician. That's where I was in Washington State. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Was licensed as a physician. So in all of these states and territories, it's regardless of whether the person is licensed as a physician or registered as a naturopathic doctor or naturopath, the educational requirements are the same and the examination requirements are the same. So I'm going to focus on that for a bit. Any kind of regulation or any kind of licensure or registration in the US requires a 4-year bachelor's degree in most people go through a science-based bachelor's degree, but it doesn't have to be, as long as you can cope with the science. And a 4-year doctorate, first professional doctorate level degree in naturopathic medicine. And that has to be from one of the accredited naturopathic medical colleges or universities. There are 2 in Canada and 6 now in the US that are accredited. So programs that qualify a naturopath to get registered or licensed in the US, those schools have to be accredited by the Council on Naturopathic Medical Education. That is a private, not-for-profit entity that has responsibility and recognition from the U.S. Department of Education for setting the educational standards for naturopaths in North America, both the U.S. and Canada. And the CNME is made up of administrators from all of the naturopathic universities that are accredited. And so essentially it is professional self-regulation of the educational standard. And as I said, the educational standard is to that of a primary care physician. So whether you're going to a state that recognizes you as a physician or not, you are trained to that standard. Along with the requirement to graduate from an accredited program, you also have to pass 2 sets of qualifying board examinations. After your 2nd year of education, you have to pass a set of basic science, biosciences, and mostly anatomy, physiology, pathology, but also microbiology and a few other ologies in there as well. That's a full day of exams. And at the end of all of your clinical training, you have to take 3 days worth of clinical board exams, which are paper-based exams. They're not practical in nature. And if you pass all of those exams and you graduate from your program, then you can go and apply for your license or your registration. So the exams, similar to the accreditation of the colleges, the writing of the board exams is a matter of professional self-regulation. The exams are written by an entity called NABNE, the North American Board of Naturopathic Examiners. And the exam questions and design are done by naturopaths and other experts in the field. So this is again a professional self-regulation, but it has been recognized by the U.S. Department of Education as being rigorous enough to qualify a person as a physician. The education in North America, the core modalities in the education for naturopathy at this point are quite a bit broader than those in education in Australia, and so we get more modalities and less of each, essentially. And so there's not as much depth in some of the modalities, but there are more aspects to them. So for example, I'm qualified to do cervical adjustments or spinal adjustments, high velocity, low amplitude, and that's part of my license. I don't do it because it's an art that I haven't really absorbed, but I am qualified to do it. So the curriculum structure when I went through Bastyr University really mirrors conventional medical school, and it was arranged that way on purpose to lend validity to the structure of the education in the eyes of the mainstream educators and regulators and legislators that were looking at naturopaths to license. As I said, it's only 17 states and 3 territories. There was a point in time when all of the states in the U.S. registered or licensed naturopaths, and then came the AMA and the Flexner report, and the rest is history. It went down to 2 states for a while, and then it's been building back up 1 state at a time. So the lesson there is go for national registration. If you go for it, don't do it 1 state at a time because it takes a really long time. I think that we've gained 3 states in the last decade, so it's very, very slow. And the scope of practice across all of those states, as well as the recognition of naturopaths, is very variable from state to state. And so certainly I don't have time tonight to talk about the full variety of that, but we'll touch on a couple of states. And then the licensing is managed by state boards in the U.S. That's the same as conventional medicine, so that's just the way it is in the U.S. So the upshot of talking about all that is to recognize the importance of the fact that the profession has to organize itself. The profession has to organize its own educational standards and hold itself accountable for rigor. whether that's scientific rigor or qualitative rigor or safety rigor, as Stephen is going to talk about. It is about making sure that we are demonstrating that it's important to us to have rigor in our education and rigor in our level of performance so that we are safe and effective at what we do. In the U.S. at the state level, I'll just give a couple of examples of a couple of states. So Washington State, as I mentioned, was my former state of practice. The licensure there is as a primary care physician, and the scope of practice is very similar to, imagine a GP here in Australia and then lay all of naturopathy on top of that. So that's what the training was, and that's what the scope of practice is. So invasive physical exams like pelvic examinations, fitting cervical caps, inserting IUDs, those sorts of things, stitching superficial wounds, nothing that goes down deep into the muscle, giving injections, doing IV nutrient therapy. There's a couple of states that the scope is even broader than in Washington, and naturopaths are doing things that I would call decidedly unnatural in those two. Drug prescription is also part of the scope of practice, so all drugs, including medical cannabis in Washington State, except for a couple of controlled substances that are very controlled, mostly morphine derivatives. In Washington State, because of a law called the Every Available Provider Law, naturopaths have to be covered by the private health insurance companies. Naturopaths already have that coverage here in Australia, so that's not a battle that necessarily has to be fought fresh here at the moment, although in the future it might have to be. States for comparison, California and Colorado both have lower level licensing or registration. I think they're actually, in California it's called license, in Colorado it's called registration. There is protection of title. Oh, I didn't mention, in Washington State there's protection of title of naturopathic physician, and nobody is allowed to use the word naturopath to describe what they do, and so it doesn't create confusion in the public. Compare California and Colorado, where there is a bifurcated protection of title. Registered naturopaths or licensed naturopaths in California or Colorado are known as naturopathic doctors, and they have protection of use of the letters ND or use of the title naturopathic doctor. However, other people who didn't qualify as naturopathic doctors can still call themselves naturopaths in both of those states. And so that creates a lot of confusion amongst the public. So the lesson there is really, determine what title you want to protect and try and go for absolute protection of that title, because otherwise it creates so much confusion. That doesn't prevent people from calling it something else, though. So going forward and calling what they're doing natural therapies or something like that, that's not protected. Slightly less of a scope of practice in California and Colorado compared to Washington. There's no drug prescription in Colorado at all. Of course, medical cannabis is legal there as well as recreational, so that doesn't matter on that level. But in California, naturopaths can prescribe drugs with the oversight of an osteopathic doctor or a medical doctor. So what's been gained by licensure laws in the regulated states? Mostly it's been protection of title, as I mentioned, governmental recognition of naturopaths as primary care providers, and coverage under health insurance policies, as well as drug prescription in some places. Also, really solid placement of naturopathic medicine in the complementary medicine research field. What hasn't been gained is the quelling of the anti-CAM crowd. So the equivalent of the Friends of Science and Medicine here in the US, there's Quackwatch, and there's sciencebasedmedicine.org, and you can go visit their websites if you want to give them traffic. I recommend against it. We are currently being dragged through the mud by one of our own, a woman who graduated from Bastyr shortly after me, and who had a bad experience practicing in Arizona and is now dragging naturopathy through the mud as an ex-naturopath. So the cohesion of the profession, I think that we haven't gained real cohesion in the profession. There is a portion of the profession that's quite cohesive, but given that there are so many states that are not licensed and it's a free-for-all for naturopathy in those states, there hasn't been a real cohesion of the profession nationwide, and recognition of by insurance companies of what naturopaths do and reimbursing us at the levels that really recognize how much time and effort we spend with our patients as compared to medical doctors. That also hasn't been gained. So.
Great, thanks, Kate. Did you want to say this for potential questions? Does anyone have any specific questions at all for Kate?
Yes.
Just grab that through the microphone.
Hi.
Speak nice and close to it.
I'm just wondering, to gain registration in America, what did you, as naturopathic, give up? Was there anything in your philosophy or anything that you had to say goodbye to?
Nothing had to be given up in terms of the written scope of practice recognizes that we do rely on the body's self-healing capacity. The word vitalistic or vitalism is not used in the scope of practice laws generally, but there is a recognition of that. I would say that in the places where naturopaths are licensed to prescribe drugs now, we have migrated away from more traditional practice and migrated towards more mainstreaming of naturopathy, which breaks my heart, honestly. But it is the reality of the situation. I have to say, on the other side of that, the benefit of being able to prescribe drugs is that you can take someone off a drug without sending them back to their GP. And that's a fantastic thing. So in terms of things that we've lost, I think a basic sort of movement away from more traditional modes of practice has been lost. Certainly there has been a division of the profession over things like vaccination and homeopathy. Those are probably the two hot button issues that are fragmenting the profession right now. And the argument over science versus tradition, common sense versus what the published research says, and the corruptness sometimes of published research, etc. So that's too much for me to go into here.
That's great. Thanks for
Shut up now.
Thanks for that. So we'll have to leave it there in terms of just to stay on schedule. Thank you very much, Kate. Appreciate that. Next we've got Ian Breakspear. Thanks very much for giving us your insights on those important topics. And again, thanks so much, Kate. You raised really good points for us to think about and to educate us on various relative situation in America. And yeah, thanks again now for your talk as well.
Okay, so can everybody hear me okay there? Great. Max invited me to talk today about some of the recent changes in education within naturopathy, herbal medicine, nutritional medicine in Australia. So one of the biggest concerns that have come up recently is around the removal of advanced diplomas and by default bachelor degree becoming the new minimum standard for education. And there's still a lot of concern, a lot of misinformation around that, so I thought I'd address a bit of that tonight. But I thought something to reflect upon. When I first started studying, which was in 1989, in the Australasian College of Natural Therapies, Rita was one of my teachers when I was in second year, so Rita remembers me well with that little tiny moustache that I had at the time, which is pretty bad, I must admit. When you think about it and reflect upon that time, it was only a diploma. There was no advanced diplomas, there was no fee help to support students going through, and yet it was a 4-year full-time program. 26 years later, I came back to Australasian College of Natural Therapies, this time as Program Manager for Naturopathy and Western Herbal Medicine. And the college has just been undergoing an audit recently, and they've been told to cut their program back to a 2-year full-time program. By then it was advanced diplomas, not diplomas, and it was now a 2-year program. And that's something to really reflect upon. That's quite a few years. Where's the progress? What happened to progress? So looking at bachelor degrees particularly, because that's where we're at now, they're not new. They've been around for a number of years. Southern Cross University was one of the first pioneers of this. Southern School of Natural Therapies as a private college pioneered as well. Endeavour College has been offering them for a number of years as well. But unfortunately, as we found now, all of the clinical-based programs within universities have disappeared, unfortunately, and now it's up to the private colleges to hold the mantle here. But for a large portion of the early 2000s, advanced diplomas dominated, and they dominated all of the private colleges, obviously, and of course bachelor degrees found it very hard to compete. When you think about it, a shorter program that was less expensive was attractive to people. So bachelor degrees that were longer and more expensive were harder to compete. But there are a lot of weaknesses with the advanced diplomas that have been identified by a lot of people within the educational sphere, within the clinical sphere for a long time. And they were really particularly short on the basic sciences, they were short on history and philosophy, and they were short on critical reasoning skills and clinical specifications. And that wasn't necessarily a fault of the colleges as such. It was built into the training package, and it was limitations built into the training package that the colleges had to largely abide by. So there were a lot of attempts by the colleges to get around these deficiencies. I know when I came back to ACNT, one of our first missions was to try and get approval for a 3-year advanced diploma of naturopathy, which was an improvement on 2 years, and we eventually did, and we rebuilt the courses. Professional associations developed their own standards to go on top of the training packages to ensure that the gaps in the training package were ideally addressed. But there was a real brick wall steadily being reached, and that brick wall was essentially the fact that in the Australian qualification framework, which specifies different levels of qualifications, not just discipline specific, but broadly what each level of qualification means, advanced diplomas were situated in what's called level 6. Level 6 qualification should be no more than 1.5 to 2 years full-time, which is why the colleges were facing so much difficulty in trying to include the level of training that was necessary. And of course, as well, part of the specification of an advanced diploma is that it produces what are known as para-professionals. When you look up the definition of a para-professional, these are people that work with some direction from professionals. Do we work under direction of other professionals when we're in clinical practice? No, we're independent clinicians, we're professionals ourselves. So really the specification of advanced diploma didn't fit our professional needs. So early in 2013, the health training package was up for a continuous improvement cycle, and what are known as subject matter expert groups were established to look at each of the qualifications in turn and see what needed improvement. I was on one of the members on the Naturopathy and the Western Medicine subject matter expert group, and basically the aim was to get some improvements. But after many months of meetings and debate, the main areas of improvement that we identified were a need to improve the clinical training specifications, to really write that effectively within the training package rather than leave it up to the colleges to try and implement it and guess what is required. To specify critical reasoning and independence practice. That is at the core of what we need to do as independent practitioners, but it wasn't well specified as an outcome within the advanced diploma qualifications. And of course, more specification of basic health sciences. But a common theme started to really emerge at this point, which was that essentially to do this, 2 years would not be achievable. 2-year advanced diploma would not be able to achieve these outcomes, plus the fact that it was taking it outside of the scope of what was supposed to be an advanced diploma type qualification. So that led to the Industry Skills Council setting up a few rounds of consultation, which started in late 2013, ended in November 2014, to basically see whether stakeholders felt it was aligned more effectively at AQF6, Advanced Diploma, or AQF7, which is Bachelor degrees. And the majority agreement was definitely Bachelor degree, and as a result, finally in December 2015, the Advanced Diplomas of Naturopathy, Western Herbal Medicine, Nutritional Medicine, and Homeopathy were removed from the health training package, and colleges are allowed to continue teaching out until 31st of December 2018, but any new intakes beyond that December 2015 had to be not into an advanced diploma. And that, by default, left Bachelor degree as the new minimum standard. Now, interestingly with this, and considering the context of tonight, registration really wasn't at the heart of this decision. Whilst we know that it's likely as a profession we will need bachelor degree as a minimum standard if and when registration comes about, I'm going to focus on when rather than if, it wasn't really at the forefront of our minds when we were debating whether we should go to bachelor degree or stay with advanced diploma. The educational requirements and the professional outcomes, the graduate outcomes, were first and foremost. What did the profession need? And the profession needed people qualified at bachelor degree level. It needed that level of training, it needed that level of critical reasoning skills and independent practice specified by the bachelor degree. So, some questions that people have come up with since then. Is my advanced diploma obsolete now? No, it's not. It's most certainly not. Sure, there might be a need to upgrade to bachelor degree sometime in the future, but it's not an imminent issue at this stage. And associations will continue to recognise. Should you upgrade? Well, I think investment in your own education is never a bad bit of money spent. So, you know, if there is that opportunity, if something grabs your interest, and even if it's beyond bachelor degree. For instance, my diplomas were all I had until I went straight into a master's degree many, many years later. So you can have that as a potential pathway in some cases. Uni upgrades, fewer and fewer of these available now, mostly upgrades through private colleges that own and operate degree programs themselves. That is an option. Do degrees mean more science and no history and no philosophy? No, I think actually potentially the opposite. We have the ability within a degree program to really capture more of the essence of philosophy and more of the essence of history. Something people often don't realise within the vocational education training sector is that that sector doesn't really want to focus too much on the underlying theory and history and philosophy underpinning any kind of discipline. It's focused on skills and competent performance of those skills rather than understanding that history and philosophy. So the training packages were understandably lacking in that aspect. So I think in many ways, with degrees being the new kind of default standard, we have more of an opportunity to capture that history and that philosophy and really integrate it into our training. There's some individuals, and there's been some debate that I've been involved in, that have said, oh, degrees are just advanced diplomas with research units tacked on, which is complete garbage. Anybody who knows anything about research knows that you don't do original research at a bachelor degree level. You do it beyond that, and it is much more than just about reading and interpreting and applying research, which is obviously an important skill that we can do with bachelor degree training. But it's that critical reasoning, it's that performance at a higher level and problem solving at a higher level in an independent practice situation. That is really what degree training is about. So where to from here? Associations, I think, something we've all got to think about. We're all, I imagine, members of professional associations. Some of you are student members of associations. Ask what your associations stand for. Don't just assume that they all stand for registration, because there are some that don't. If you're paying your money to that association and it's not supporting registration, and you think registration is the direction our profession needs to go, then unfortunately you're actually spending your money on a group that's going to lobby against the survival and the future direction of your profession. So that's something to think about. And also think about what the place of professional associations will be in a post-registration environment. They won't necessarily cease to exist. There's that possibility, but they don't need to cease to exist. There's the possibility that they could adopt many other useful roles, and questioning your association about what their plan is for the future, I think, is a really good thing to do. So I think that's it for me.
Okay. Excellent, thank you. Yeah, so thank you. Okay, so any questions for you? Yeah.
So in how will grandfathering if someone with advanced diploma work?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
How would someone who's got an advanced diploma, how would they be grandfathered into the registration process?
Yep, that's something that I think probably John's more able to answer, but obviously it's at this stage, because we don't actually have any registration situation, you know, it's something that's obviously will need to be looked at as we move closer and closer.
Okay, another question, I've just got one or two questions. So these personal trainer courses and the integrated online courses for nutrition, where would AHPRA and AHPRA stand on that?
I think, to be honest, a lot of the movement towards online education we need to be very careful of, and I think it's going to come up in the process of registration that they're going to be obviously looking at minimum face-to-face hours, minimum clinical contact hours, etc. And a lot of these online courses now are being, unfortunately, you know, chopped of a lot of that aspect.
So what about, so coming back to that, someone like, so who's done a personal trainer course and they start handing out health knowledge or health advice, could we, if they're not registered, how would AHPRA or then take care of that type of person?
I think that's, again, something you're likely to answer. Yeah. So John will probably fill in a lot of those gaps.
That's great. That's good questions. Anything else?
No.
Any other questions from anyone? But Ian? Okay, well, thank you, Ian. Appreciate that. And next we've got John Wardle now to talk about the nuts and bolts of what it means to be registered on the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency. AHPRA.
I've not been texting, I've just been taking notes. So here we go. I just want to, I guess, leverage off Ian's talk and just highlight, I think degrees have been unfairly maligned that they have no philosophical content. When in fact, for at least the last 15 years in Australia, they're the only qualifications that have actually specifically had formal sections of naturopathic philosophy and history included. The advanced diplomas redefined naturopathy as nutrition, plus herbal medicine, plus one of massage or homeopathy, and included no other aspect in the definition of naturopathy. So advanced diplomas did not formally include any history of philosophy, and any history of philosophy in those courses was purely because the lecturers themselves felt passionate enough to actually put that forward. Southern Cross had very, very strong history of philosophy. Endeavour has very, very strong history of philosophy. The degrees have really been the guardians of history and philosophy, and quite frankly, it really irritates me when people malign the university sector or the degree sector as being the ones removing that from them. The advanced diploma came after the diploma, but it was not better than a diploma. It was worse than a diploma, as I think Ian says. And really, it was the college owners selling out the profession for off-study money so that they could get more students and recognition from the government to actually make money for themselves, not to help the profession. So after my little rant, I'm going to go...
I was going to say that, John, but I thought I'd be more politically correct.
Thank you. Because one thing I am very passionate about, and I often, because I do have a PhD, I work in the university sector, one thing that I am incredibly passionate about is the heart of the medicine, which is naturopathic philosophy and the history. You know, one thing that not a lot of people actually know is I'm currently writing a book on Australian naturopathic history, which extends far further than we actually ever thought. You know, the first naturopathic journal in Australia was in the 1920s, not the 1970s like most people think. There's a very, very strong history, and it really is, without that philosophy, you're not really a naturopath, as far as I'm concerned. So in saying that, in answer to your question, one thing registration will not do is remove that philosophy. The principles in philosophy are actually what define a number of medicines, including Chinese medicine, which is already under that, and actually minimum philosophical and principles-based content is actually required by accreditation for Chinese medicine training, which means that integrative medicine acupuncture courses which don't have that content aren't actually eligible for accreditation by that course. The World Health Association is developing standards for education on those principles, and as Secretary General of the World Naturopathic Federation, we've just signed a document with the WHO to actually help the naturopathic profession develop those principles and philosophies that are minimum standards that global education providers will be required to follow as well. The Australian registration system works a little bit differently from the US registration system in that it's registration, not licensure. So what that means, for those that don't know, essentially a registration in Australia develops a register of practitioners, and that register requires a minimum bar of entry to actually join and retain membership of. That includes professional conduct, so you have to maintain professional conduct. You have to be constantly upskilling, so CPE is a requirement. In terms of grandfathering, existing qualifications are usually accepted. What's required is demonstration that you've continuously re-educated yourself every year through that CPE requirement. So if you were someone with an advanced diploma or a diploma, you don't have to upgrade to a bachelor degree, you just have to show that you've been maintaining membership, maintaining insurance, and maintaining continuing professional education in the field in which you're being registered. What that also means is the minimum bar to entry is usually education. So that will be bachelor degree education. Perhaps higher in the future, we don't actually know. The education system is completely changing in Australia for everything. We don't even know what's going to happen in 10 years. But it's not going to retroactively require people to meet a new qualification that are already in practice. You have chiropractors out there who have a diploma of chiropractic. You have Chinese medicine practitioners out there with a diploma of acupuncture, or advanced diplomas of acupuncture, or qualifications from deepest, darkest China, and I don't even know what they're called. They've been assessed as being competently trained, and they're included as long as they're maintaining their professional standards and they're maintaining their continuing professional education. What registration means is it protects the title. So it actually allows you to use the title naturopath and restricts other people from using it. It does not restrict your scope. So Australia actually has a very unique provision. It's quite a free market here kind of country where your training and your insurance determine your scope. And I don't think a lot of naturopaths realise this, that there's actually significant voluntary restriction of scope by naturopaths in this country. I've seen it in education providers who have wanted to include IV therapy in their courses and have been told by the associations that's not naturopathic, you can't include that. It wasn't the government saying that they shouldn't do that. I've seen colleges remove hydrotherapy, I've seen colleges remove physical medicine. It was not the government, but it was voluntary self-restriction. And I think as a profession we need to reflect on what we've actually held ourselves back on and not try and blame some imagined restrictions that don't exist to come in place. So if you can demonstrate that you're trained in a modality, you can practice that modality. It doesn't have to be trained in your course, it can be continuing professional education training. You just have to show that you've been trained to be a competent and safe practitioner. You have to carry private indemnity insurance for that particular act. So one of the common arguments I've heard against registration is insurance premiums won't go up. They won't go up. Insurance companies are very smart. They know exactly how risky naturopaths already are. But if you bring on new invasive scopes, and of course your premiums are going to go up, they're less safe. Acupuncturists have to have insurance for acupuncture. If your insurance doesn't cover acupuncture, you're going to have to include additional insurance for acupuncture. Associations. Associations will still exist, and I think they'll have a much stronger role under registration. Currently, associations cover a pseudo-regulatory role, and they don't do it very well, I should add as well. There's a case here that we can actually see is very, in New South Wales, of a naturopath without qualifications, a massage therapist who was a member of an association. The association was told repeatedly for a period of 12 months that she was practicing without qualifications. They chose to do nothing. I've worked on a case with the AHPRA of a patient who was bullied by an association when she tried to make a complaint against a practitioner who had abused them. I've worked with a number of other cases where clear failures in the self-regulatory aspect of regulation of naturopathy. And it's not just naturopaths too. There's actually a case with the Dietitians Association where the government is actually investigating the Dietitians Association for their treatment of practitioners who use low carbohydrate diets. They've been restricting unfairly those practitioners. One of the other things I'm often, so associations will finally not have this role. The resources they use to perform that role can actually be put back into you guys, into promoting you guys as a profession, to promoting the profession in ways that it's not been promoted before. So associations in Australia, I think, have relied on this pool of members coming to them for the pseudo-regulatory status for so long, they've forgotten to actually advocate for the profession. And to think that associations will die out after it, you just have to look at the chiropractors, the acupuncturists, the osteopaths to see that that's not actually true. The osteopaths actually have 90% retention of the profession after registration in one association. And there are other numerous associations that carry most of the remainder. So it's not necessarily the case that will mean the associations disappear. One of the issues I've heard about is the complaint system. Once the complaint system is in place, people like Friends of Science will complain about you. If they're not complaining about you now, they won't complain about you then. The reality is, currently exactly the same complaint system exists in New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, and soon Victoria, and soon the rest of the states and territories in Australia for registered and unregistered practitioners. The only difference is what happens to those complaints once they're received. In a registered profession, they go to the professional board made up of your professional peers. In an unregistered profession, they go to some guy, and it is a guy currently, who's the Director of Investigations at the AHPRA or the equivalent body. So the professions are involved in determining whether that person has acted inappropriately or not. So the idea that somehow you're protected against complaints by not being registered is not true at all. Harm is always a fun one. One of the things that a lot of people will talk to me about is we have to recognise harm if we're going to be registered. This is true. Registration is for professions that can do harm, but my challenge would be if you want to practice a profession that is not harmful, then you have to give up ingestible medicines, you have to give up treating any patient who has ever seen any other kind of practitioner or is on any other kind of medication. You have to give up unsupervised practice, and you have to give up clinical autonomy. These are the things that make naturopathy potentially harmful. It's not harmful because naturopathy doesn't do good. It's harmful because in the wrong hands it can cause harm. Most practitioners practice very safely, but unfortunately, as we have seen this week and the last couple of weeks, that's not always the case. And it really is a case of reducing the harm and maximising the benefits. Harm, unfortunately, is not something you get to choose whether you do or not. You either do or you don't. And the reality that has been uncovered by every report looking at this issue is that naturopaths do potentially have that harm. How many minutes have I got left?
You've got about 2 minutes.
Oh, okay, not very much time. Okay, so one of the other things is for the profession that we need to think about is the infrastructure for the profession really doesn't exist in naturopathy at the moment. We have no national standards. We have no national bodies, truly national bodies. We have no clear educational standards. These are things that real professions need to have. They're the infrastructure that registration relies on. So one of the things that many people don't realise is the GST free status of naturopaths actually relies on us developing a registration system. The private health insurers have already said that they want to restrict to registered professions only. We don't have these restrictions yet, but if this infrastructure at least doesn't get developed, and if we don't move towards registration, there's a very real reality that this might actually be taken away from us. So I think I'm nearly done, okay. I've got a couple of points here. So one of the things I do want to also talk about are the complaints. So I was recently with AHPRA working on their chiropractic advertising issues. One of the things that's very, very clear is a lot of people are concerned about AHPRA attacking them for advertising the wrong thing. So when you advertise something, you're advertising to a broad public and making broad sweeping judgments. If you don't have enough research to advertise that naturopathy definitely fixes this, then you can't advertise that. That does not mean that you can't do that in practice. Practice is highly individualised, it's contextual. When you make non-contextual statements, that's what you get in trouble with. If you're putting it in context, then it's perfectly okay. And AHPRA actually recommended this with asthma for chiropractic, for example. So, there is no evidence saying that asthma definitely helps chiropractic, but it does help some asthma patients. So as long as you are using it in the context of the individual in that case, and it's clinically justified, then most practitioners will have no worries about the philosophy. We're scared of Friends of Science, and I think we give them undue credit for many of this. Occasionally they get one hit out of 100 tries that they actually do. Really, it's not a case that the whole world is out against us. It's just a case that we only hear the bad stories, and we don't hear the 99 that actually got through. So I think we need to remember that it's very easy to remember bad stories. It's less easy to remember good stories.
Great, thanks, John. Now, I know there's going to be a few questions, but I'm going to start with a question that was sent to me from a person in Perth, and it's a specific question on who actually is going to sit on the complaints panel. Mm-hmm. And they asked whether Friends of Science would actually have a chance of sitting on that panel.
Well, the current makeup of AHPRA boards is that they need to be a minimum of 9 members, 6 of which need to be people from the profession, so naturopaths, in the case of the naturopathic board, 3 of which must be community members. And usually they require 1 to be a member of one of the other professions. Just so that there's some interplay between the boards. But the reality is it's going to be a majority naturopathic board with the insight of community members. And I can tell you now that when you look at the other community members on the AHPRA board, Friends of Science aren't on any of them. AHPRA will not include them on any of them because they don't represent the community. They want someone who legitimately represents the community, not someone who represents certain professions or ideological viewpoints.
Okay, so any questions? Thank you.
I've got some.
Nice and loud, good.
Sorry, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, great. Nutritional medicine and aroma, should that be included as part of the aroma model? And the question I got from one of my colleagues is, how can you explain how naturopaths cause significant harm when the AHPRA review states that naturopathy doesn't work according to their model?
The NHMRC review, for one thing, did not state naturopathy doesn't work. It stated that the evidence that naturopathy does work was not directly transferable to Australia because of the lack of regulation. So if for anything, for me, that actually makes a further case for registration because they were concerned that the lack of training or the lack of regulation meant that sending someone to a naturopath, you couldn't be guaranteed that they were a trained naturopath. So they actually said that trained naturopaths had evidence for a number of chronic conditions, but it was a lack of regulation that meant that that could not be extended to Australia. So I think that makes a very potent case for registration. And I've actually written a critique of the AHPRA review, which will be open access, and I think I've posted on the NPN already on Facebook. The other thing with nutritionists, one of the issues that nutritionists have with the Rona is they actually aren't a recognised profession in Australia yet. There's a lot of groundwork that needs to come up before they can get to the stage where we can do anything with them in the Rona. So, you know, they don't have a, what they call an ANSCO code, you know, like naturopaths, herbal medicine, chiropractors do. They aren't actually, there's no formal standards, there's no association, the Rona is not an association. So, you know, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. We've provided representatives of the nutritional medicine profession everything that Arona has to help them develop their model, but at this stage we can't include them in the Arona model because simply we don't have that base work to work, that foundation that we need to work.
Two more questions. What is the time frame for registration, do you see, and what happens to Arona after registration?
Okay, so look, there's two speeds in government, there's stop and tomorrow. So if they make the decision today, realistically you're looking at 5 years before implementation, before the first registration tranche goes through. Arona has worked and has always stated that it is working towards obsolescence. If registration occurs, Arona will hand everything it has over to the board. And one of the primary reasons for Arona is to actually prepare the profession so that when registration does occur, it's not a hugely divisive and chaotic experience for the profession. So some of the infrastructure that Arona develops, like the Accreditation Council, which is now accrediting courses in Australia and New Zealand, like the councils, education councils and the other professions, will probably be hived off into an independent body to continue that function for that board, because none of the boards do that themselves, they all have independent functions that do that. So, but Arona itself will no longer continue to exist.
Last one, do you think you'd see yourself working on the board when that goes through? I might, it's not up to me. So I would be interested in helping them out. I don't know if I'd be interested in being on the actual AHPRA board itself. So, I work with a lot of AHPRA boards currently, and so I'd probably choose to retain that to be able to work across boards rather than. And let people that are actually, and frankly, I work in a university now. I don't practice anywhere near as much as I want to, and I'd much prefer someone who's actually a full-time practitioner in that role.
Excellent, thank you. Any other questions at this point? Yeah. Nice and loud, good, thanks.
Yeah, hi. So I go to Endeavour College and two of you are my teachers. I was actually wondering how much communication there is between different colleges that teach Bachelor of Health Science and Naturopathic and Nutrition. So ACNT, Endeavour, and the other one, Educator. Yeah. How much do people from the Board of Education or from those schools actually speak to each other in terms of curriculum? I've got this little game that I kind of like to play where every time I meet a doctor or every time I go to the GP, I ask them, what do you actually think of naturopathy today? And a lot of them say it's very hard to take a profession seriously when not even the schools can actually agree on what a curriculum looks like. And within each of those subjects themselves, there's different amounts of evidence that one needs. For example, one subject in pharmacotherapy might need a certain amount of scientific evidence for it to be considered a complete subject, and then the other school might need more philosophical. Sorry, I'm ranting on, but that's my example. So, how much communication is there between, say, the different colleges in order to actually be taken seriously in terms of a standard curriculum for everybody? If that makes sense.
One thing that I would like to just point out is that colleges don't have to teach the same course. So, there have to be minimum standards of accreditation, but colleges, the individuality of different colleges is very, very important. And I don't know the American system as well as Kate does, but if you look at the US colleges, for example, Breakspear is known to have a very strongly, what they call a green allopathic, a very scientific program, same as CCNM. Whereas Bridgeport, for example, is probably a little bit more on the holistic point of view. So, there is variability. The standards don't mean that everyone has to do exactly the same thing. And medical schools in Australia are exactly the same as well. So, there's huge variability between the medical. What they do have, though, is a national key consistent set of guidelines, and that doesn't exist for practice, education, or actually anything in naturopathy at this stage. We've got too many associations, each of them have their own guidelines. Arona's did some competencies, and actually some associations, including some associations that don't want to admit it, they've actually asked us if they can use our standards but not acknowledge them. And we're fine for that as long as there's some kind of, as long as they're using them. But the education, TEXA, for example, are now requiring some colleges to actually have the Arona standards, and we're trying to get standardisation that way, but currently that doesn't. So, your medical friends are right, unfortunately. That infrastructure that exists in other professions, that's needed for those professions to be taken seriously, and quite frankly, was done for most other professions 50 years ago. Even chiropractic had this 50 years ago. Hasn't been done for naturopathy yet.
Thank you. Is that a question you can address as well, Stephen? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, excellent. Thanks. Right, we'll better leave it there. Thank you very much, John. Appreciate that. That's excellent. Excellent, thank you. So now we've got Sandy Davidson. She's going to speak about the where do the nutritionists stand and what's the future for holistic nutritionists here who are working in the holistic model. Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you, Max. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you, everyone, for your words already. So, I'm a naturopath, but I'm also a program leader for Endeavour College, and I've actually been in education for a long time. But this evening, I'm not talking on behalf of Endeavour. This evening, I'm talking completely on behalf of myself and my ideology and philosophy, and I think where we need to head. And I think that, to some extent, our industry for a very long time, I want to say, with Ian talked of the many different associations we have, and we've had a range of different education providers, and we haven't really been a very cohesive mob to this point in time. And to a large extent, we're still very divided, and we're divided in terms of those that are pro-registration. Everyone on the panel this evening, including myself, are pro-registration, so we actually support, we'd like to be practitioners that are regulated under AHPRA. But there's obviously others that, other schools of thought that don't, and I think probably everyone here this evening is pretty much, on the registration side of things. But nutritional medicine, and I'm going to have a few notes written here, I've got them in 16 size font, so I may need my glasses. I might put them on just in case I get it wrong. Okay, so look, the big four in naturopathic education, and John talked to this very eloquently, and certainly, it's true, a naturopathic philosophy is very much embedded in higher education providers' Bachelor of Health Science Naturopathy qualifications, which is absolutely great. But it wasn't completely devoid in advanced diploma qualifications either at a particular moment in time. And Ian said when things changed at the introduction of the training packages, things did shrink and things did change quite dramatically at that period of time. And thank goodness we're back where we are now at a Bachelor of Health Science qualification as a minimum educational standard, and I think that's very important. But the big four of naturopathic education in Australia at that time, so 20 odd years ago, was herbal medicine, Western herbal medicine, nutritional medicine, massage and homeopathy. And so what's basically happened with the introduction of, and at that moment in time, the advanced, many students that graduated would receive multiple awards. So they would actually get, a diploma of advanced naturopathy, qualifications in nutrition, herbal medicine, homeopathy and so forth. So they ended up with all these, particular qualifications. Now, it's changed with the introduction of the bachelor qualification, unquestionably. But what we've actually done, what we've seen in this time, we've actually seen that the focus of naturopathy education is very much centred on Western herbal medicine and nutritional medicine. And in fact, the bachelor qualifications the naturopathy degrees, essentially in terms of core theory